Good morning, everyone. I'm Commissioner Cindy Jeffries. I will be facilitating this morning's session. I want to welcome everyone back, both the committee, the subcommittees, and the public. This morning, we're going to start with roll call, and then we will do some updates on some outstanding issues and move promptly into the agenda. First, I'd like to remind everyone of your naming convention. Please make sure that your name is conforming so we know briefly your constituency and your name and your primary. So with that, let's start with our roll call. This morning, we're just going to call the constituency and the primary. Just introduce your name and we'll go through this rather quickly. So for Department of Education.
Morning, everyone. Jennifer Hong, Federal Negotiator.
Okay, and along with Jennifer, assisting her is Brian Siegel this morning. Is that correct?
That's correct. Good morning, everybody.
Okay. Accrediting agencies.
Good morning, Heather Perfetti here.
Good morning. Dependent students.
Pause on that constituency group. Cindy will come back.
We'll come back to them. Federal Family Education Loan Lenders and/or Guarantee Agencies.
Morning, Jay O'Connell.
Good morning, Jay. Financial Aid Administrators at Post-Secondary Institutions.
Good morning, everyone. Daniel Barkowitz here.
Hi, Daniel. Four-year Public Institutions.
Good morning, everyone. Dr. Marjorie Dorme Williams.
Good morning, Doctor. Independent Students.
Hi, Stan Andres. I'm here
Okay.
as a alternate.
Okay. Are you sitting in for Michaela this morning? now?
She did not inform me that she would not be here, but I can be on
Okay.
if she's not yet.
Perfect. Thank you, Stanley. Individuals with disabilities or groups representing them.
Hi, good morning, everybody.
Good morning, Bethany. Legal assistance organizations that represent students and/or borrowers.
Good morning, this is Persis.
Hi, Persis. Minority serving institutions.
Morning, Noelia Gonzalez.
Good morning, Noelia. Private nonprofit institutions.
Hi, everyone. This is Cindy.
Hi, Misty. Proprietary institutions.
Good morning, Jessica Berry.
Good morning. State Attorneys General.
Hi, I believe Joe should be joining, but I'm the alternate. I can sit in for the time being.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
State Higher Education Executive Officers, state authorizing agencies and/or state regulators.
Hi, David Tanburn.
Good morning, David. Student loan borrowers.
Good morning, everybody. It's Jerry O'Brien Losey.
Hi, Jerry. Two-year public institutions.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Bobby Ayala.
Good morning, Bobby. U.S. military service members, veterans, and groups representing them.
Morning, Justin Hausfeld.
Good morning, Justin. And the advisors, are you with us this morning? I see Heather and Ron.
Aurelia, advisor for economics, higher education, analysis, and data.
Okay, wonderful. All right, I see Joe has now joined from the State Attorney General Office as the primary. And do we have anyone from dependent students with us?
Good morning, Greg Norwood sitting in for Dixie.
Okay, good morning, Greg. Did I miss anyone? Okay. So with that, I'm going to move on to a couple of announcements. First of all, we want to give you an update on Ms. Ann Precythe. According to the consensus yesterday, the committee placed her on the committee as well as the Prison Education Program Subcommittee. FMCS has reached out to both her and her assistant and we are currently awaiting a response from them. On the request yesterday to add additional public comment time, we have this response for you. The 30 minutes every session that is afforded during the 5 days of each session is more than what has ever been offered before. It has been 3 days in the past. It is also what has been published in the Federal Registry. In addition to this 30 minutes, there were 3 days of public hearing for people to comment. There will be at least an additional 30 days for people to submit written comments during that NPRM period. We did add a waiting list to the 30 minutes. So in the event if the 30-minute time slots aren't filled, or there happens to be a gap or additional time, we do have the waiting list that is being utilized and has been utilized. So at this point, we think that the system is working fine, and we'll continue with the 30 minutes and the waiting list. So with that, we will move into today's agenda. Jessica, you have a question?
I do. I just have a question and a comment about yesterday. Coming into this second week, I had a lot of questions about how we would structure our conversations because we have so many different topics to cover and they're all super important. But I wanted to bring our attention back to closed school discharge. You know, I feel that is a really important topic that affects all of our schools. And when I looked at the end at the temperature check, you know, 75% of the negotiators voted it down. So I feel if we are going to come to consensus by the end of this negotiated rulemaking session in week 3, more discussion needs to happen. So I urge the department to think about that and circle back to that yet in this week.
Thank you, Jessica. And I was just about to jump into that and address it. Given the response to the outcome of the temperature check yesterday, we do want to kick this off with additional discussion, especially from those who had their thumbs down, which, as you indicated, were numerous. Okay. We would like to spend some time this morning for those who had their thumbs down to briefly hear from you as to why you had your thumb down and what a possible solution is for that. Because as Jessica said, you're trying to reach consensus here. And so the department needs to clearly understand and hear what your concern is and what the possible solutions are that would get you from here to here, at least, okay? These temperature checks, they have value and they're extremely important. They give everyone a reading of the sentiment in the room as to what's before them. And so at this point, we'd like to open it up for those of you who had your thumbs down first and briefly tell and articulate what your concern was and what you see as a possible solution. Jessica.
Okay, so this might be a good time for us to describe more the proposal that we put forth. I know we were one of the groups that proposed late, and I apologize for that. It took us a while to come to a consensus just amongst our small group. But let me bring that up for myself real quick as we're discussing it. What we want to bring attention to, and Heather and Daniel, you know, feel free to jump in at any time. But what we want to bring attention to is that there are situations where closed school discharge is applied because these situations, the department considers it a closed school for other reasons. But we think that those should be excluded when it comes to closed school discharge. So the first one, if you have our proposal under A, an example of this, just so I can explain it, is, so say you have a school system and they have a main campus, say in New York City, just for an example, and they have a branch campus in Florida. And both schools operate completely independently. They have their own presidents, their own resources, library, all those things. And so say the pandemic hits, and this is the pandemic's fresh in our minds, so I'll use as an example. And it's almost impossible to operate the New York campus because things have been closed down for so long, enrollments decline, the rent's really high there. So the school system decides to close the main campus. Now that main campus has a 6-digit OPE ID, and that branch campus that's back in Florida has an 8-digit OPE ID. And so when that main campus closes, now there's no home for that 8-digit OPE ID that was tied to that main campus. So say the group that owns the school system also owns another school system that has a separate OPE ID. And they're just transitioning that 8-digit OPE ID to the other school system, the other 6-digit OPE ID. This doesn't change anything at that school. The students aren't affected. It's really just kind of a corporate structural change. But there have been instances where schools have been assessed liabilities for a closed school discharge for, say, those students that are at the Florida campus. So we wanted to make sure that that's addressed in A. In B, this would be, so say I have a school and enrollment is increasing and I need some additional space. So I rent one classroom from another local college and I'm using it. And that's considered an additional location.
30 seconds, Jessica.
Okay, say a couple years later, enrollment changes, I don't need that location anymore, and I stop using it. Right now, that's considered a closed school, and that could be a closed school discharge. And then the last one is, say you have two eligible schools offering predominantly online classes. One closes down, students are able with minimal disruption to transfer to the other campus. That's also something that we would like for you to consider. And Heather and Daniel, please jump in if you think I missed anything there, if you want to add anything.
I think you did a great job summarizing.
Okay.
Cindy, is it okay if I add to the comment?
Sure.
So I would just add, in addition to the example that Jessica provided for area under A, I know for us as an accreditor, we have also had public institutions that are going through consolidation efforts. And in those circumstances, one of those institutions technically may be considered closed, even though they are consolidating with another public institution. So this is not just about corporate restructuring, it is also about what is happening among public higher education systems. And so this is why we were looking for what I call a carve-out exception, so that in that circumstance, if the system continues to deliver on its promise to students, continues to retain the academic programs for students, and the shift is more of an administrative shift. Granted, that can have impacts on students. I'm not saying that it cannot, it certainly can, and accreditors do look at how those decisions impact students. But what we were looking for was, in some circumstances of mergers, acquisitions, or some kind of transaction by any other name, that those institutions that are being subsumed, consolidated, conglomerated, whatever the language may be, that a system or two separate institutions may be using, that there is some recognition in the definition of closed school. What I discovered in talking with the presidents of other accrediting agencies is there's not consistency on this point, and there's not a definition that helps with this particular set of circumstances. And so the group that came together was trying to be cognizant of the impacts in those kinds of circumstances. Thank you.
Thank you, Heather. We're going to move to Jay, but before we do that, I want to note that Josh will be sitting in for legal aid instead of Persis for the purposes of the discussion on this. Jay?
Thank you. So I appreciate all the issues being negotiated and understand we're doing that in the context of the direct loan regulations, but I will be unable to agree if I can't see the FEL impacts until session 3. And ideally, we could see them as soon as possible so that our constituency can understand how that impacts our students and schools.
Thank you, Jay. Jennifer?
So just real quickly to summarize, Jay voted no because she doesn't have the FEL language. And for the group that put forward the proposal, the sticking point is the definition. But generally, we're okay with everything else, just narrowing the definition. Am I understanding that right?
Jessica, you want to respond to that, or?
I do have other issues with it that I discussed yesterday, but this was the one issue that we didn't get a chance to discuss.
I think, Jennifer, yesterday I had mentioned the question that I had about the stackable credentials and the issuing of a credential, and in the current definition, it seems broader than maybe necessary. And I know we never really circled back to that conversation.
I'm sorry, since you asked the question, I would also, I'm sorry to jump ahead, but I would also suggest, I'm looking at the PEPS database, which is the Post-Secondary Educational Participants Database. And looking at that database, I think it's important for us to understand the number of closed schools. I understand that we typically think about and again, I have no objection to closed school discharge for the cases that have been brought forward, like the ITT techs or the New England School of Art, those situations. But I think there's an assumption that closed school, when it happens, are these big ticket items. It would be helpful to have, I could give you a number, but I think it's an unreasonable number and probably not right based on the database. It might be helpful to understand how many schools have closed, because this is a much larger issue, I think, than perhaps we all understand. This occurs with fair regularity in terms of school closure. So, and I think that might be helpful as a context. So I'm not sure if it's possible for the department or our analyst, our data analyst, to pull those numbers, but that might provide some very helpful context, Raj. I'm looking at you, kid. That might provide some very helpful context for us as we continue this conversation.
Can I just respond to that real quick?
Thank you, Daniel. Do you want to put that request in the chat so we don't lose track of it? Jennifer, did that answer your question? Do you have what you need on those first two?
Yeah, let's continue.
Okay. Marjorie, you're next.
Great, thank you. So I would absolutely second what Jessica, Heather, and Daniel have shared. Both for private and public institutions, this happens, unfortunately, very frequently. And so I would be, I think, cautious about penalizing schools that have no control over, unfortunate circumstances. We know, for example, MSIs are continuously underfunded by their states, which impacts enrollment and their ability to attract students, and that can lead to a school closure. My other point, and I feel like I haven't really gotten a clear answer about this. My understanding is this is about right? The schools that close, sometimes they're big ticket, sometimes they're not. And providing relief to borrowers because this institution is closed and for whatever reason, they're not able to continue there. For students who re-enroll, I feel again, and I shared this yesterday, that we're almost penalizing them for continuing their education. And I'd like to see a more consistent process that has to deal with the school closing and not whether or not students enroll or don't enroll. Again, I think if we're thinking about solutions, you know, perhaps we can create a formula that's based on the amount of credits that they can transfer, because we're now adding debt, time, additional burdens to students who are simply seeking to continue their education. So I really would either like to see a response or to see that addressed more directly in the language beyond just sort of the process of, yes, they have to apply and fill out an application.
Thank you, Marjorie, and thank you for putting forth, I heard a couple different solution ideas. Jennifer, do you want those ideas captured in the chat or are you capturing them on your own?
Where again, I'm gonna defer my plea for any proposed reg language. If there's specific areas in the regulations that you can point to make your suggestions, that's the most helpful, because we're on such a compressed time frame. Mm-hmm. We look and analyze it that way. I know on a sidebar, I know Raj had a response to Daniel's inquiry, so if we could get him on the record to respond, that would be great.
Yes. Raj, do you want to go on the record with that response that you put in the chat?
Sure, yes. So this is actually something I thought might be useful to the committee. So we've been working on it. Don't have it ready just this minute, but I should be able to get it today. Effectively, what we were going to do is take the closed school record from the Department of Education website, merge it to IPEDS data. So not just have a record or kind of a demonstration of schools that have closed over time, but as much as we can, some student demographics and some student counts associated with it as well. So I'm happy to share that probably tomorrow is the earliest I can get it done.
Okay, thank you, Raj. Next we have Josh.
Thanks. I don't think it'll come as any surprise that the big sticking point for me relates to automatic discharges for those who attended pre-2019 and in particular those who attended pre-2014. And I think the easiest solution there is just to scrap that comparable program requirement as it relates to those borrowers. The other thing I would add, which I think might be helpful from a data perspective for this conversation, is data related to ED's recovery from institutions after a closed school discharge, because I've heard a lot about, you know, the threat to schools, and I'm not actually aware of this being a thing that ED routinely does. Like I know in like the ITT context, for instance, you know, ED filed a claim in the bankruptcy, but you know, the school is gone, and so ED's ability to recover is actually pretty minimal, and I think that's true across the board. And so I think that type of data would also be really helpful for this conversation.
Okay, if you want to put that request in the chat so we can follow up on it, that would be appreciated, Josh. And thank you for clearly articulating your concern and a potential solution to that. Again, I'm going to reiterate what Jennifer requested from the department, that the reg text is the most helpful. So if there's some way you can transfer that, your solutions into that and get it to the department, the sooner the better. Okay, so they have time to look at it and formulate a response. David, you are next.
Echo Josh on the discharge, the automatic discharge. I think his proposal makes sense. Just scrap the comparable program requirement in the regulatory text. I really appreciate what Jessica and Daniel discussed, because we are seeing more complex mergers, consolidations, and the like, and that crosses all sectors, nonprofit, private, and now most recently in the publics. I also, talking with SHIOs in the various states when they're dealing with closures of institutions, many of which are quite small, mom pop type institutions. Their efforts around recovery and their assistance with the Department of Ed is they're not recovering much money, and is the sense we got. But I would love any data on that. But my sense is when it's closed for a reason, and that's because they don't have any money. Just leave it there. But thank you for this opportunity to discuss my concerns.
Thank you, David. Appreciate it. Jerry, you were next.
Hi. First, just going back to Marjorie's statement, I'd like to make a plea for appropriate funding for our institutions, especially our state and public institutions. But I just want to remind people when it comes to the students, when we add layers of hoops they have to jump through, that regulatory language could just be like, it's not up to the students to create the next steps. So whether or not they move on to another institution, this particular institution failed them in some way. That there is just forgive that so they can start fresh. And I just want to remember that at the end of the day, it's the students who are harmed no matter what severity people think that might be. And so I just want to put that out there.
Is there a solution that you had in mind, Jerry?
Yeah, streamline the process for the students to be able to be forgiven. I mean, we can play if then all day. We can play if this, if a butterfly flaps its wings in New York, there's a rainstorm in China. We can do that all day long. But at the end of the day, it needs to be a streamlined, less words is better process, because it is the students who need to understand this at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you. I need to mention that Michaela is back in as primary. Welcome, Michaela. And I see that, Brian, you put something in the chat about the GAO report. Did you want to speak to that, or?
No, there just been some discussion about statistics. The GAO report does have some statistics on closed school discharges. We think Raj will be able to provide, more. Hopefully, we'll have more updated information and complete information tomorrow.
Okay, thank you. Oh, let's see. Joe, you are next.
Hi, thanks. I think we would do well to go back to first principles, and I think Josh said it well yesterday. If you go to the statutory authority here, it says it basically says if the school closes, the loan shall be discharged. And I think that the more we can simplify and bring it back to that principle, what Congress wanted here, the better we're going to do. My objection is based on the fact that although I think that the regulation has come a long way, right? There's some really good things in here, and the main thing that I think is a positive is the return of automatic, and automatic being within a year. Those are really good things. But right now, this doesn't change what happens immediately after a closure, from my perspective, right? If I'm in the office and a school in Illinois closes, I know that I'm going to get deluged with complaints, and I know that I'm not going to be able to give students a good answer about whether or not they're eligible for closed school discharge. And that's because of the window, right? Because of the 180-day window, the students are going to be panicked and they're going to want an answer. And I'm going to have to tell them, well, you might need to stay at the school for some amount of time. And I know that it's, Sounds ridiculous to have to keep taking out loans, but if you really want the loans discharged, we need to wait and see when this is going to happen. And so, yes, automatic is good, but it does not, what we have on the table does not solve the immediate problem when the school closes. And that's when students are making decisions. And, you know, we have a student loan helpline. We have people that are trained. Unfortunately, we've had to deal with a lot of these in the last 5 years, 6 years. But, you know, people are emotional. Students are harmed. They're, you know, Michaela said it well yesterday, they're just discharging the loans or just being able to transfer some credits is not going to eliminate the harm. They feel like they've spent a lot of time and effort. They feel like they were, you know, they felt like they were going to be able to complete a degree at an institution, in a program, in a specific space, and that's been taken away. And so, unless and until we can create certainty at the moment of closure as to what the options are, I have a problem with what's on the table.
Okay, so I think what I heard, Joe, was that one of your main concerns is what happens in the immediate aftermath of the closure. Do you have a specific solution or idea of how to address that?
I do, and I presented it in the first session. It's up on the website. It's a simple fix.
Okay. Is it in the form of the reg text?
It's in the form of reg text.
Okay.
I did not conform it to the new text. I don't think it will be that hard to do that. I think the text is roughly the same.
Okay.
On the, you know, the question of the window.
Okay.
But as long as there's a set time frame, it's going to allow schools to play with that. Right? It's going to allow schools to, and I'm not saying all schools will do this, but it's going to allow some schools to say, you know what, I got to close and I'm going to announce it before the window and I'm going to try to get people to transfer to my other campus and I'm going to, you know, try to keep people from taking advantage of the discharge.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. Michaela.
Good morning, everyone. First, for the folks sitting at home, want to let you know that the number that was put in the chat was 246,000 students that were borrowers enrolled at 1,100 colleges. So we have almost 250,000 students and just over 1,000 institutions. Mind you, while these institutions could be held liable or given a bill for this, those are not people. Right? These are institutions. And like, I mean, having sat through BizOrgs, there's also, you know, the corporate veil. So it's not very likely that an individual will be held responsible for those dollars. It's incredibly unlikely. And I would encourage somebody to find me a case in which a school, like an individual, could be held liable for the debts of the institution. And I think that when we're talking about harm caused to the institution, we need to remember that we're not talking about harm caused to humans. You know, 250,000 students that thought that they could get a degree from an institution that cannot. You know, and so my question is really to the folks that are saying that these institutions shouldn't, you know, they are worried about the impact of them being held responsible, is that if we were to take out that one line that says institutions can be held liable, I can quote it. I'm sorry, I get a little worked up. But Jessica, if we strike that line, does that resolve all of your issues? Because then there's no responsibility to the institution.
So can you articulate clearly what your concern is with the current language that has you thumbs down to get you to at least halfway, and what your solution is?
I was halfway. I was halfway. I thought that it had gone through the list of folks who are thumb down. I was in the middle yesterday, but okay. I'm trying to understand if we want this to pass, if, you know, the folks who are thumbs down on the side of not having a clear definition of close school. If those concerns would be resolved by striking what Josh had suggested, that one line.
Okay. Thank you, Michaela. Appreciate that. Justin.
Yeah, thanks so much. So hopefully I can do this in an orderly fashion and not to forget the specific solutions that the department is looking for. But we would echo the concerns raised by Josh and Joe. I don't want to belabor the point, but we do think it's appropriate to take a more expansive look at auto discharge here. We think the points that Joe and Josh made yesterday, Joe today, Josh yesterday, made about Congress's intent with regard to the statute are particularly compelling. And think the department should take a closer look at that. Also, just want to take a few minutes here, or seconds, hopefully, to highlight the impact this is having on students. And I think, we're talking a lot about students transferring from from one institution, one that's closing, to another institution, trying to complete their degrees. But the GAO report was really clear here that transferring schools is a difficult process. Getting credits to transfer is not a particularly successful endeavor in many cases. And as one of the public commenters yesterday, Colin Wilkins, pointed out, it really has a whole host of other impacts on students that are not just academic in nature. We're talking about this upending their lives, leaving students stranded. They do face difficulties in the academic sphere, again, trying to get things like transcripts. And just generally being left without a lot of clear options and choices when their initial intent was to finish at a particular school. So we think, in terms, again, of specific solutions, the department should take time to consider a more expansive view of automatic discharge and the proposals that Joe and Josh have both put forward. Thank you.
Sorry about that. Had myself muted. Thanks, Justin. Jen.
I think Jessica had her hand up before me.
Okay, Jessica.
Thanks, Jen. I put it down and then put it back up, so I ended up in the wrong spot. I just wanted to say to Michaela, I totally respect your comments. And yes, recovery from institutions is important to us. And the reason why it's important is because those carve-outs that we talked about. So it isn't always a closed school that is being assessed these liabilities. Sometimes it's a functioning school that just closed like a classroom location. And so it can really affect the financial health of a fully functioning institution that's doing really well. And I think too, one thing that we want to think about is, as schools struggle, and we know the pandemic has been really hard on a lot of schools in a lot of different sectors. There are going to be schools that are going to be reaching out to other institutions asking for help to see if they will help them. And if this is in place, they might be less likely to help them in those situations because they'll be afraid they'll be assessed to liability. So my suggestion, I don't know if this is possible, if it sounds like just amongst all of us, there's a lot of confusion on how these liabilities are determined and issued and carried out. Is there any way that FSA could make a short presentation to us just to explain that process? Because, like I said yesterday, I've heard from schools, but I don't have a lot of data on this actual process. If FSA was able to give us some information, maybe that would help us feel more comfortable.
Thank you. Thank you, Jessica. Jen?
Yeah, thank you. Okay, so I don't have any solutions. My solution is center students like this committee should. I think the language that is being used, for example, Heather says, certainly it can have an impact on students. It does have an impact on students. Like there's no it can. Jessica, you mentioned that liability is an issue. We understand that, like, it's not something that we don't understand. We understand there's administrative things that we can't control as students, but we're students. Like, we go to schools because we're from low income communities. We're students of color. We pick schools because they're near us and we want socioeconomic mobility. We need to go to institutions that we're able to, get into different positions to help our families, to help ourselves. So even if location is important, it's important for us too. So if schools are going to be doing that, then they should tell us that, hey, we might not be here all the time. So then we wouldn't like sign up for them and then get screwed over by all these institutions. This language keeps centering institutions like the whole morning instead of centering students. And I think it's very hard for students, like Dixie mentioned yesterday, to feel that y'all are actually advocating for them, or we're advocating for them. I'm sitting here listening to all of y'all, and it's more institution-based, and you want to make it sound like we don't understand the administrative part about it, as though we don't go through the ropes of having to sign up for financial aid, having to talk to institutions about how our credits can be transferred, if they're even transferable, having to understand if we're able to get to a new location because they moved, they decided they're closed, but not officially closed. So now I have to fly hypothetically from New York to Florida or Florida to New York. Like, if you talk to all these institutions, then why don't you give us institutions? Why don't you give us the information that they give you so that they're not hypothetical, so that we could actually understand? Because otherwise, as students, you're telling us, well, maybe these places can help during the pandemic when institutions need help. We're already in that pandemic. We've been almost 2 years in the pandemic. I graduated my whole senior year in the pandemic. And it's like, we know things are happening now, so then why not give us concrete information? Because it's really hard. It's really hard to sit here and listening to y'all talk like these students are just numbers. And Michaela is right. They're students. They're thousands of students, hundreds of thousands of students in comparison to buildings, locations, administratively. And then like we have all these teachers that also are professors that have to also deal with finding new jobs. So please center students. And, you know, I don't have any way of telling y'all like any solution. My solution is center students because it's really tiring and it's only day 2 in week 2. Anyways, thank you.
Thank you, Jen. I hear you. I think what I heard is that communication is a concern. In terms of the text itself and the regulatory rule, is there something that you or someone you know from the student tab that would help you, you know, at least be like this on the language for post-school discharge, recognizing it's something that needs to be included into that text? Did you want to respond to that question, Jen, or?
No, I mean, so my communication is not the problem. I mean, technology communication has always been the problem with the DOE and students. Some of us are first gen, some of us don't have the technology available to us or the access to internet, and we have to do a lot of footwork. My thing is, we're not really centering this need of the students, we're centering the need of these institutions. And all we hear is, well, the institution could do this, they can do that, instead of how can we help the students through these institutions? So that's my point. So it's not communication. And maybe it is communication because it seems like we don't understand that centering the students is valuable.
Okay, thank you. Joe.
I don't want to speak for Jen, but I think that one thing that would help students is if there was certainty about their options once the closure is announced. You can transfer your credits, you can discharge the loans, right? And have those options solidly in front of the students when the closure is announced. That's what my proposal does.
Thank you, Joe. Appreciate that. Heather?
Thank you, and thank you, Jen, for your comments. So I just want to add that accreditors do collect student-centered and faculty and staff-centered information once we become aware of a closure. And we do try to communicate that through the mechanisms that we have available, but we also require the schools to communicate with students and for them to produce those communications for accreditors, including the option about closed school discharge and that's available to students. So I did just want to note that in addition to asking that we look at the definition of closed school discharge. We, as an agency, have a number of procedures that institutions, when they are aware of closure and when they announce it and bring it forward for us, we do have information that we collect that is very much student-centered. So I just want to reiterate that. My other question that we've not yet circled back to is the provision about the school granted a credential in a program while the student was enrolled in a different program. And so that's sort of a separate issue that I brought up initially, just because I was trying to better understand that provision and the nature of where that is coming from. So I don't know if that is the department or if that was a proposal that came forward from Josh and Persis, but I did just want to try to better understand, in light of the movement towards stackable credentials, what this is trying to address here.
So yeah, we can talk about that further if you have more comment on it, Heather. This was meant to address the issuance of retroactive credentials to students that had the effect of denying them a closed school discharge. So we wanted to prevent that from happening in the regulations through our definition of program. And I think we've addressed it. I do believe that, I think Josh and Persis raised it as well. But so that's the answer to that question. Generally, what I'm hearing is, this proposal, we've gone back and we've actually expanded, made the definition of school closure less restrictive, and catching the concept of comparability on the back end when a student enrolls in a comparable program, but still keeping it open in terms of their eligibility for closed school discharge. That's the intent behind this proposed rule. I understand that the sticking point is this proposal put forward, in terms of narrowing the definition of closure by the institutions, while legal aid and AAGs feel that we should do away with the concept of comparable program altogether. So that's what I'm hearing. Correct me if I'm wrong, but we can talk briefly about this credential stacking. I see Josh's hand raised.
Josh?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to the credential stacking issue. In addition to retroactive awarding of degrees, as Jennifer just mentioned, we've also encountered the problem of schools forcing borrowers into an associate's program before a bachelor's program, even when they only want to do the bachelor's program and even when they believe that they're working towards the bachelor's program the entire time. And then the closed school discharge only wipes out the loans associated with the bachelor's, but not the associates. So the one thing I would note as well with respect to this idea that there are innovative stacking programs, this definition only is implicated if a school closes. And so I don't think it's restricting schools' innovation. I think it's just restricting schools' manipulation, and again, is only implicated if the innovation didn't work and the school closes.
Thank you, Josh. We have one last hand, which is Greg. Unless someone has a solution that has not been shared after Greg, we will move on to the next issue. Greg?
Thank you. And this may sound like a non-issue, but Dixie and I were just wondering, we were listening to accreditation talk about how there are different methods by which to communicate to students when schools may be closing, but just wondering how effective those methods have been in ensuring that students are aware of not only the fact that their institution is closing, but what to do as a result of that moving forward. And so it's in a question and not necessarily solution based, but I would challenge that because again, we're centering students. And so to say, have this almost vibe that we're doing what we can to alert students of these different changes and challenges. I think I would just question its effectiveness in ensuring that students know what to do, not just that it's happening, but what to do and how to handle it moving forward.
Thank you, Greg. All right, Jessica, and then we're going to move on.
Sorry, I just had one last thing. There seems to be a lot of confusion around under the definition of program of A, B, and C. Is there any way Jen could just walk us through it briefly so we're all on the same page and understand where the department's coming from?
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So, okay, so under Romanet 3I, program means the credential defined by the level and zip code in which a student is enrolled, except that the secretary may define a borrower's program as multiple levels or classification of instructional program codes if, and again, we think we've expanded it so the secretary has a definite or discretion to determine whether an institution has placed a student in a different program, or as Josh stated, force their hand in terms of enrolling or awarding them an associate's degree so that they would be ineligible for discharge. So A, B, and C is an attempt to capture that. A is if the enrollment occurred at the same institution in closely proximate periods. B is the school granted a credential in a program while the student was enrolled in a different program. So it's kind of obvious that this kind of dual enrollment was foisted upon the student. The program stack or were presented as necessary for borrowers to complete in order to succeed in the relevant field of employment. Again, that goes again to the forced hand of the student. So those three scenarios are ones that we're aware of, that we've identified. I think they cover the ones that Josh and Persis have encountered as well, and they're presented here so that the secretary can consider these scenarios and still issue a discharge. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I think so. I was looking for more examples, but I don't know if you have examples of any of those.
Yes. So again, to go back to I think Josh was alluding to this, if a student is in a DA program and then the institution awarded an AA, this provision would prevent the student from being ineligible for the discharge. In other words, if the institution had awarded the AA under the current regulations, they would not be able to avail themselves of the discharge. However, now that we've put this language in, they will be able to avail themselves of the discharge. For B, the school granted a credential in a program while the student was enrolled in a different program. So that's an example of a student getting issued an AA degree, therefore making them eligible for discharge. So we wanted to ensure that we wanted to prevent that from happening. For C, if we see things like we would enroll someone in a certificate and then the borrower would finish and then they say, oh, but you really don't need the AA. So we want to make sure we pick that scenario up here. I don't know. I see Justin and Joe's hand raised. I don't know if they can fill this out a little bit more as well.
I think that was helpful though, Jennifer. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Joe, do you have something briefly to add to that? You're muted, Joe.
I've seen stacking in my investigations, multiple investigations. I've seen it. One of the biggest areas that we see is nurses. People want to be nurses. The school says, great, get a medical assisting certificate. You don't need a medical assisting certificate to become a nurse. That happens all the time. That happened at Corinthian. That happened at ITT. Less so at ITT because they had nursing programs, but we see it with, at Corinthian, we saw it with graduate degrees where, or no, I'm sorry, this is a Kaplan example. There was a student who had been at Corinthian. She went to Kaplan. Kaplan was stacking her with a master's and then a PhD. So stacking happens all the time. We see it across schools. And so I think this is a positive effort by the department to try to account for that.
Okay. Thank you, Joe. All right, seeing no more hands, Jennifer, do you have what you need?
I do. I know we'll come back to this discussion, but I will say that the department will take the re-enrollment piece under consideration. As far as the proposal put forward by the institutional representatives and Heather, the crediting agency, we this kind of narrows the definition of school closure where we're trying to expand it. So I know for certain for B and C, we wouldn't be able to take the proposed language that you put forward. And we do have some concerns about A as well. So I just want to put that out there as we continue to think about this.
Okay. I want to thank you for being candid with that. And Jessica, Heather, those of you on that proposal, hearing what they had to say, perhaps some additional thought or solutions might pop into mind. Okay. With that, we are going to move on to, I believe it's issue paper 3, interest capitalization. Is that correct? Okay. Jen, do you want to walk us through that?
Sure. This might be one of our shorter discussions, I'm hoping, and it was initially as well. One of the things I wanted to say on the outset is we had proposed, first of all, nothing has changed. The deletions that we proposed in the regulatory text to remove capitalizing events where we have the discretion to do so still stands. We had expressed that we would be able to provide conforming FEL language in the first session. However, upon further analysis, and we've already reached out to Jay to communicate this to her, we found that we simply don't have the legal authority to do it on the FEL side. And I know Brian is available to talk more about that if necessary. So what we have is before you, I touched upon the retroactivity piece early on. Basically, it's just simply not feasible to unwind years of payment to address capitalization. It's also prone to error. So we wouldn't be able to make changes attendant to that proposal. We did look into whether we could cap the amount of interest when it is required by statute. We also don't think that would be feasible. The department would have to have a basis for justifying any sort of cap. And the cap would still have to apply each time it happens, meaning that borrowers would still see repeated acts of capitalization. And we just believe that the cost of these items is better spent on improving our other discharge programs. So it was my sense that we were in a very good place with this. There was very little discussion last time. I think we can all get behind removing these capitalization events. I think this is a boon for borrowers. I see Percy's hands up, so I will be quiet now.
Thank you, Jen. Jennifer Persis.
Yeah, so I had a couple of thoughts. I mean, first to the retroactivity piece, you know, it's certainly disappointing to hear that the department's not willing to consider applying this benefit retroactively. I hear over and over again from borrowers who are drowning in debt, who have paid back well over the amount that they ever initially took out. I remember working with one legal aid organization who had a borrower who took out $5,000 in 1989 and somehow managed to stay in a forbearance up until now, and so she now owes $125,000, and all because of capitalized interest. And this borrower will never get out from under this debt, and I think that's really, really tragic. So so that's disappointing. The other pieces that I'd like to talk about is some of the other programs in which the department says it does not have authority. I mean, certainly one of my questions is with deferment. You know, the reasoning why we want to get rid of capitalization for forbearances certainly applies to deferments, though I recognize that there is a statutory barrier. I'm wondering if there is a creative solution that we can apply through through the ICR statute to mimic these deferments so that borrowers can have an opportunity to make these pauses in their repayment without having to suffer from interest capitalization. And the other piece that we had discussed at week one was about consolidation and whether or not it was possible through a consolidation to not have interest capitalized. And I'm curious to hear more about the analysis that the department engaged in to determine whether or not consolidation could, we could keep the interest and the principal separated through that process. Thank you.
Thank you, Persis.
I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Jennifer.
Great. Thank you for that, Persis. As far as, well, first I want to clarify, we did take the issue of retroactivity under consideration. We did take it back, and our conclusion was that there was no neat way to do it, and we just feel like our money is spent best elsewhere in improving our other discharge programs. So it's not that we didn't take into consideration the deferment. We haven't, as you mentioned, it's statutory. We haven't found a solution to that. We're certainly open to hearing about that. And if we want to discuss more of the consolidation issue, we are open to hearing more from you all about what I guess what this would mean for the borrower in terms of keeping the principal and the interest separate. I think we just need to hear more from this committee in terms of creative solutions on that end. In terms of consolidation, first, I guess just trying to get an understanding of how this committee feels about that. If we could just kind of revisit the consolidation issue, we're certainly open to hearing ideas on that front.
Jerry.
I like what Persis just said. Separating the principal from the interest, I think, would go a long way to, especially considering the communication issue with students, because students don't understand the difference between forbearance and deferment and income-driven repayment plans, and that I think that is one way that we can look toward making it not so burdensome. I was thinking about the example Josh gave yesterday, which was given when the at one of the other one of the other hearings about the woman who had $6,600 and ended up owing $27,000. Like, it's just a money maker for people taking advantage of students. And if we can separate that interest from the balance when people are moving their money around, trying their best to understand all these extra words, that I think that looking deeper into that would be key to help people right away.
Thank you, Jerry. Suzanne has stepped in for David. She has a question to ask. So Suzanne?
Yeah, thank you. This question is for the department regarding statutory authority. I mean, so I served on the repay committee, and we were able to make that plan more generous by limiting interest accrual and capitalization. I guess my question is, I mean, the ICR statute, as I recall, has a fair amount of flexibility. Is there something we could do to limit the amount of interest accrual to begin with and put a cap on that so there's less interest to capitalize? Is there a workaround in that regard? Because yeah, the promise of the income-driven repayment plans are quite undercut by these capitalization events. I understand there are areas where there may be statutory barriers, but I want to know if there's a possible way to, I have to refresh my memory on everything about the statute, but we dealt with this in repay and we were able to limit interest accrual and therefore capitalization in that context.
So we did remove it. We removed the capitalization event in ICR.
Right, can we put a cap on how much can accrue to begin with?
Right, I mean, that's the issue that we looked into, and we didn't see a solution there.
Thank you, Suzanne and Jennifer. Persis.
Yeah, and I just wanted to underscore for the importance of consolidation, as we're talking, we're going to be talking about public service loan forgiveness, I assume, later today. And in the context of thinking about the PSLF waiver, one thing that I hear a lot from folks is that if there are fellow borrowers who want to be able to take advantage of the PSLF waiver, they're nervous about consolidating their loans because there is this consequence that if they have unpaid interest, that it's going to be capitalized into their principal. And if for some reason their employment doesn't wind up qualifying, because they have to do consolidation first before they can ever enter the process, that this is a real barrier to folks accessing the programs that are great, that are, intended to do a really good benefit for borrowers, but they have to take this first step, and it's a leap of faith that they're going to consolidate their loans, their balances may grow, and if it doesn't work out, that's going to have pretty devastating consequences for folks. So I think that addressing the capitalization event in consolidation is very important for making our other programs functional.
Thank you, Persis. Anyone else? Jay.
So just in terms of consolidation, I mean, I'm thinking of borrowers who are paying on their underlying loans, making regular payments, and then they consolidate into PSLF. So they've been making their qualifying payments. I mean, our requirements are that you apply payments to outstanding interest first and then principal. So I'm just thinking of the math that there may not be that much interest outstanding if you're moving from the 3 underlying loans to a consolidation and you're paying as agreed. You're only going to cap the month or few months of interest from that process, which interest will continue to accrue in consolidation. Time is as much a factor. I mean, I know capping increases costs, but time and interest accrual is really a factor, I think, in some of these examples. And I had requested, if we could have some data that helps us really understand the implications of capping. I don't know if Raj was able to produce that or not, but again, in terms of the PSLF example where someone's making qualifying payments, I just don't know that there's going to be hordes of outstanding interest from those underlying loans because they should be paid.
So the people who are going to be who will be in an income-based repayment plan, many of those folks have negatively amortizing balances, and those are the folks for whom many of those folks thought that they were in a qualifying payment, which is why this PSLF waiver is so important to begin with, right? So they have negatively amortizing loans in IBR, and they are very understandably nervous. I mean, another thing which we can put a pin until we get to the IDR conversation is making sure that those IBR payments still continue to count as qualifying payments under income-driven repayment, in addition to PSLF. But yeah, I think that there is still a good number of people who do have negatively amortizing loans and income-based repayment.
Understood. Thanks.
Thank you. Seeing no, Jerry.
Sorry, Cindy, because
worries.
that's my fell situation. Just to clarify, I am in that situation where I was put in something besides income-driven repayment plan to gain extra interest when I should have just been in an IDR. So I am the poster child for that particular example, and praying that the look back will help me in some way. But it is a very real issue, and people do have to decide what choice they're going to have in that process. So I just want to clarify that out there.
Thank you, Jerry. I think what we're going to do now is take a quick temperature check on where everyone is at with what's before you on the interest capitalization. And so if I could see thumbs. Okay. Not seeing any thumbs down. Just was double checking. Okay. That was a good outcome. Let's for the time being, let's move on to the next issue. And on this, I'm just going to, and we'll come back to the interest capitalization. On this next one, Jennifer's going to walk you through it and explain all of the changes and nuances in issue papers 4 and 5. Jennifer?
Thank you. And just to close, we're leaving the loop open on interest capitalization. Just please, if you have any proposals in terms of ICR, we're open to seeing those as well. Okay. 1 second here. Okay, just to recap here, this is proposed regulatory text for PSLF. You might recall that we separated out 2 issue papers on PSLF, one having to do with improving the application process, and the other is on employer eligibility and full-time employment. We did provide some draft regulatory text in the first session, mostly having to do with the application process, but I will review the changes to the reg text as a whole, and we can discuss it all together. But when we take the temperature check, we'll take it on each issue, the application issue and the employment issue, eligibility issue. We did receive a proposal from Heather on PSLF, our PSLF advisor, on Friday. We weren't able to consider those changes for this draft, so please do jump in when your respective suggestions are relevant to this review that we're going through right now. Just a couple things. I'm going to point out areas where we made changes in session 1. because for some reason the highlighted portions did not carry forward on the PDF. You may recall, I believe most of our discussions were on the employer eligibility side last time, and there seemed to be more tentative agreement on the application piece. Either way, we took a lot of your suggestions and added them here. So let us just jump in. We've got the text queued. So on page 1, just a minor technical edit to employer employed by breaking the text up into subparagraphs 1 and 2. At the bottom of the page, we changed adjunct faculty to non-tenure track employment. We've also flagged the credit hour conversion to get a better idea from you all regarding how other states calculated their conversions and an understanding of how they justify those numbers. Because I remember we had last time talked about 3.35 as a conversion. We made a minor change to the military service definition. This is going on to page 2. And that's to include service by veterans and further streamline this definition. We've also added several other definitions here, including non-tenure track, which encompasses all those categories you see there, adjunct, contingent, part-time, full-time, faculty, teachers, or lecturers at institutions of higher education who are not on tenure track lines. So please flag anything if you see something missing from that. Minor technical edit to public interest law to remove the qualifier regarding the provision of legal services to be provided by a public service organization. We've added a definition of public safety services. And then moving on to page 3, we've added several definitions for public service, and you'll see those new definitions for public service for individuals with disabilities, public service for the elderly, public education service, public library service, and school library services. Next, staying on page 3, I'd like to draw your attention to the definition of qualifying employer. Under 1, we flagged an edit for you with the addition of United States based. And basically what we're interested in here are your thoughts on this definition. We're trying to do a few things. First, listing the types of government service that can qualify. Second, we're trying to make clear that organizations like the UN, the WHO, et cetera, are not qualifying employers, even if employees of state that make up American delegations are federal employees to qualify. But also to make the point that foreign governments are not qualifying employers. Finally, we're mindful of the fact that tribal governments have the right to self-determination and generally operate outside the scope of federal or state law. So we flag that for discussion. Under paragraph 3, we've added an attestation piece. So let me just read this part aloud and let's take a pause here for some discussion about this section and also how it relates to approving contracted employees who work for eligible employers. So what we added under a private, this is paragraph 3, a private organization that provides a public service as defined in this section, attested to by the employer on a form approved by the secretary, and is not a business organized for profit, a labor union, or a partisan political organization. The secretary may substantiate the employer's attestation based on a review of information in the secretary's possession about the employer. I think there are more changes here rather than go through all of them. I see a lot of hands raised. Let's pause there and take any questions or comments up to that point And then I have some questions about the contracted employees, but let's hear from others first.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Jerry?
Hello. Just going back to the 30 hours or equivalent by each credit hour taught for non-tenured faculty. I will be providing some information from Oregon statute, including personal testimony from during that decision, and we'll provide that as soon as I have it. And the other thing I want to, I just want to give a +1 on the public service. The last section you were just talking about, capturing the healthcare workers, especially the California and Texas healthcare workers, if that's what the intent of that is.
Thank you, Jerry. Justin?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I wonder if I could maybe just start with a quick question here. I think we're trying to better understand the department's specific intent in the redrafting of the military service definition. We know that there's some new language in there that includes veterans. We know prior language referred to, organizations serving service members. So I'm just trying to get a sense of what exactly the department's trying to do there, and then offer hopefully some additional thoughts on that.
So we felt what was there was a bit clunky. So the intent was just to streamline it and to encompass the service of veterans of those organizations as well. Make sure that that's explicit.
Is it okay for me to follow up there?
Please.
So when we're talking about those organizations, is it a reference to U.S. Armed Forces and National Guard, or organizations like veteran and military serving organizations that serve veterans or members of the armed forces?
So the way that it reads is that it's those organizations refers to armed forces or the National Guard. Are you suggesting that it should be expansive to include those organizations that serve? I realize that is a bit.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's two issues. Yeah, I think there's two issues for us here. So when we're talking about military service, I think we're thinking U.S. Armed Forces and National Guard. Obviously, we're open to more expansive definition, but we're a little unclear on how the veterans fit in here. If it's just moving in any veteran, then that is performing service that is defined as public service later in the reg, or exactly kind of what's going on there. And then we do have this separate consideration of making sure that currently excluded veteran serving organizations that may hold a 501c19 status, for instance, are included within public service loan forgiveness. So we would be happy to offer some alternative language that maybe gets at both of those things, but we would just want to get a sense of what the department was attempting to do in this provision, relative to other areas here, including in the definition of public service.
So those organizations should be encompassed elsewhere under the definition of public service. This just pertains to military service, this definition right here, and those services provided by armed forces and National Guard. And any, prior service. I think that's what's meant to encompass the veterans service. Okay. So as we go through this, let me know if you feel like we're missing those individuals that you're referring to as we get further into the public service definition. I feel like that they ought to be encompassed in later in the definition.
Okay. Understood.
Yes.
Thank you.
But yes, please provide it if you feel like it's missing.
Thank you, Justin and Jen, for that dialogue. Bobby, you are up next.
Thank you for this. If we could circle back to 1C, the calculation of the equivalent full-time. I was wondering if we might want to consider, in addition to credit hour, contact hour, a contact hour calculation. I'm thinking about those instructors at technical schools or two-year schools that teach technical programs in which they may only count for, let's say a science lab counts for 1 credit hour, but they are in fact in lab for 3 to 4 hours for that 1 contact hour. Then we may want to consider perhaps a separate calculation for that or what have you. So just wanted to see what everyone's thoughts were on that.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Bobby. Certainly I want to remind people this as well as any of these as we move forward and inch our way into that 3rd and final week of this to, feel free to present in reg text your proposals to the department. Misty.
So if I could just respond to Bobby. So yeah, so Bobby, this just goes to my question to you all. If anybody can, I know Jerry's going to provide something from Oregon, but we're interested in understanding how those calculations take place. Like, does it include those contact hours already? Does this calculate? So if anybody has the answer to that, that would be useful for this committee.
I'll see if I can perhaps draft. I'm sorry. I'll see if I can perhaps draft up some kind of a formula to present and send out.
Great, wonderful, Bobby. Thank you, Misty.
Yeah, I have a question for Jennifer and then a comment. So it sounds like we're trying to broaden on page 3, the qualifying employer, the definition to not just include 501c3 to capture things you've heard in public comments like nursing, healthcare, folks completing their residency. So with this definition, would that capture those, but just require an additional step of getting like an attestation letter that's submitted to the secretary? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yes.
Okay. It was brought up in session 1, the idea of using the SIP-SOC codes for this as maybe an easy way to potentially automate someone who qualifies for PSLF. So the SIP codes are a way to easily designate which programs we would consider working in public service. And then obviously that ties to the crosswalk to the SOC code. So just wanted to bring that up again for discussion and see. It was brought up issue on session 1 and wasn't in here. So I didn't know if there was a reason that we were not wanting to do that.
So we appreciate, we appreciate that suggestion, and we definitely heard it. We've explored it in the past. I don't think that it kind of gets to where we need to be, the SOC codes. So I think, this is why we've turned toward this concept of attestation to explore that further, because we feel like that might be more encompassing.
Okay. Thank you. Just before we move to Bethany, I want to point out that Soren Lagarde has joined the table as general counsel, and that Suzanne is in for David. So Bethany?
Hi. So I think I have a follow-up question to Misty's, because I'm thinking of the young gentleman who testified during one of our earlier public comment periods, who was a provider of disability services, but was a contract worker for a private company. And I think what the department is trying to do is get at those cases with the definition of employee or employed on page 1, but the way I read the definition of qualifying employer in sub 3(2) little I, it says not a business organized for profit. So my assessment would be that if somebody was working for a business organized for profit as a contractor with a disability service provider, they would not be eligible. But I might be misreading this. So I just, like, statutorily or regulatorily, I would like to understand if I'm reading the language right or if I'm misunderstanding something.
Thanks, Bethany. Jen?
Yeah, so Bethany, so no, you're not. So there's 2 different things here. So yes, the language as proposed, restrictive. And but we're willing to, have the conversation regarding for-profit companies. Some of the concerns that we heard in the first session is the lack of transparency around for-profits more than nonprofits, and the lack of charitable mission for some of those organizations. So it may be more difficult to assess an employer's eligibility in the context of the public service definition in the statute. So the idea here is to try and have more clarity, to ensure borrowers have, what they need to ensure that they are eligible. The second piece of that, though, is a contractual employees, and we did have some questions about that. So if we could take the for-profit piece off the table for just a second and look at the contractual employee piece, we wanted to see. We just wanted to pose some questions for the committee in terms of would an eligible employer know that a contracted employee worked for them for the time needed? And would they be willing to sign an attestation on behalf of the contractor? And then how do we, that's kind of like operational. And then a broader question is like, how do we address broader labor concerns about ongoing misclassification of employees into contractor roles? And does this risk rewarding that behavior where it allows the employer to offer benefit but not shoulder the expenses they should of employing someone? So if we could answer those questions on the contractual employee piece, if anybody has any ideas on that, and then we can loop back and talk about.
So I think that gets to what I raised previously, which is I completely share the concerns about misclassifying employees, and I think that that's a broader conversation that the labor market is having right now. But we're talking about borrowers here. We're talking about individuals who have taken out money and are are doing work that we really value and that the society has identified, via the statutory basis for this, that's valuable work to be done. And so that's part of my instincts here when I'm trying to capture these folks. I liked the attestation piece because I think that gets at some of it. And I think certainly, disability service providers who contract with, say, staffing agencies, I think would be happy to provide that verification for their employees. I understand the concerns about the classification, et cetera. I don't know that this is the right place to try and answer them since we're talking about borrowers. That's what we're trying to focus on, is making sure that folks who borrowed and now are doing public service work are getting access to it. So for what it's worth, my perspective on that would be, I think organizations would be willing to do that. And I think that we could rely on their attestation there. So for what it's worth. I had a related question, but maybe I'll let someone else talk and come back to that because it's about something unrelated to that. So I'll turn it over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Bethany. Suzanne?
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we need to focus on the public service job. That's the term in the statute, right? What kind of work is the borrower doing? And I think that needs to be the focus here, and to eliminate barriers and use maximum authority. We believe that the department has a lot of authority and discretion under HEA to make this program actually work the way it was intended. I don't want to repeat what other people have said, plus one to others, but wanted to submit for the record and for the committee's consideration in advance of next session, some language put together in a memo by some former regulators who have experience at New York Department of Financial Services, as well as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. I'll just put it in the chat. There's some proposed markup language to the regulations, and again, submitting it in for the record now as some potential solution language in the hopes that the department will consider it in advance of next session. Thank you.
Thank you, Suzanne. Justin?
Thanks. I'm actually going to defer to Heather, if that's okay.
Okay. Heather?
Hi. I'm interested in this discussion about employer eligibility in the context of the statute. And so I think we're all aware the statute governs these regulations, and the statute dictates that government and 501c3 employment, full-time employment, are qualifying. And it additionally lists a lot of public service activities. And in the interest of streamlining, automating, and simplifying this program so that it can work more effectively, I think it's important that we recognize that these definitions are duplicating the language that we're already married to, which is government and 501c3 employment will qualify. And so the question really is what else will qualify? And as the statute lists all of these public services, this committee needs to find a way to expand on government and 501c3 employment in order to give meaning to all of the statutory language. And so this takes us back to the question of whether any full-time employment will qualify or not. Rather, any for-profit employment will qualify or not. And that's an important, question that this committee can consider. But if the decision is made that only nonprofit employment will qualify, then it seems that extensive definitions are confusing and unnecessary because they simply reiterate all of the government and nonprofit work that already qualifies. So in that regard, I think it's important to consider a question of, what really is public service? What is a public service job? And that could be done much more simply by talking about, work in the common good. I would also like to reiterate the conversation we had last time about why wouldn't we allow borrowers to attest to the full-time nature of their employment? They can do so under, penalty of perjury, and the department can, evaluate whether that is suspect of fraud. But really, we're not in a situation where we're trying to limit people's ability to qualify for this program. We're trying to do just the opposite. So I will mention that although the qualifying employment is a very important conversation, really the reason this program has failed so far is because of the excessive focus on monthly payments and whether a given month counts towards the 120, and that ought to be really the meat of the conversation.
Thank you, Heather. Okay, Persis.
Thank you. I want to go back to what Bethany was saying about how important it is to have contractors, but not just contractors. I think looking at the for-profit versus nonprofit model is just not really relevant, especially for a lot of low-income workers, where certainly the tax structure of their organization has little bearing on the type of work that they're doing or whether or not they chose it. I'm thinking in particular of home childcare providers who are certainly not making a lot of money, but they are not nonprofits. And in fact, I think that, in that particular instance, and in many instances, I have clients who are home healthcare aides, they're not choosing those jobs because of the tax status of the organization. They're choosing it because that's what they can do. And they are certainly providing a valuable service. And so I would certainly urge the department to strike the is not a business organized for profit language in subsection 3, Romanet 2. I think that's the simplest way to solve this problem. And also to recognize that as two things to recognize. One, that especially when we're talking about low income student loan borrowers and we're talking about borrowers of color, they are more likely to be actually working for a public service organization that is technically by tax status organized for profit. So I think that would be a really important fix to have. But I think, as we're thinking about this in the context of bigger things, part of what I want us to also think about is this in context of all of the student loan policies, and why are we trying to ensure that all of these different employment opportunities get into public service loans? And that's because income during payment itself is so broken, and that the alternative to qualifying for public service loan forgiveness is that you're stuck in this income during payment plan that has not been working, that is too expensive, and is not actually providing relief at the end of the day. So I think as part of this conversation, I think it's worth bringing back to the conversation about income during payment and why the alternative of not qualifying for public service loan forgiveness is so horrible for a lot of borrowers and so untenable. So I just want to put that pin in that conversation to happen later. Thank you.
Thank you, Persis. Jerry, you are up next.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so I just, an idea that we focus public service loan forgiveness on the person, on the student, going back to the student and what the student does. Because if they're providing a public service, or if they're working with people with autism, boom, you qualify. If you're a social worker, boom, you qualify. That it may be easier to look from a student perspective that is turned into an employer in a certain situation, as opposed to relying so much on the employment itself in a particular organization. So it's actually the work being done is a public service for the greater good. I just want to be careful about the full-time thing. Again, going back to about 18,000 part-time academics that I work with, is that full-time means something very different to that instance. And to get people to sign off on those forms, just take away the requirement. You don't have to work a certain amount of hours. You just have to be in the public service, and do it that way instead of, adding more restrictions and language. Is to take that away and make it, if you're working in public service, you just have to verify it. There's no restriction on the number of hours.
Thank you, Jerry. Justin.
Yeah, thank you. So I think part of what I'm struggling with, frankly, is that I think there's a few different ways to accomplish a lot of what everyone here wants to accomplish through the regulatory language. Are we going to try to squeeze it all into the definition of public service? Are we going to try to, relook at qualifying employer? I saw some of the recommendations made by Heather, and she attempted to do this one way. She alluded to it in her comment just a few minutes ago. And so I think that's part of what I'm struggling with personally, where we're going to make these changes in the language, and that really impacts what the language is going to be and how we're getting at these issues, obviously. And so the concern I'm about to raise here is kind of contingent on us sorting that out. But one thing that we'd like to see considered is care provided for veterans through the VA's Comprehensive Assistance Family Caregivers Program. This is service provided for ill, wounded veterans, and frankly, service that we think should qualify for public service loan forgiveness. But it's a matter of figuring out how we want to address it in the language. And I think that's going to go a long way to helping us be able to provide you with potential regulatory text. We do have some we can offer up, but just want to flag that as a concern, and then just generally about this idea of how we're going to go about accomplishing what I think we all really want to accomplish here. Thanks.
Thank you, Justin. We have one more hand, Bethany, and then I think Jennifer will move back to you for further.
Can I just respond to Justin real quick? I want to make sure that, so Justin, are you suggesting that the current language or proposed language doesn't capture that the group that you had just mentioned?
Yeah, that's our understanding, and it has to do with some nuances about how the program's executed in terms of payment versus stipends and things of that nature. I'd be happy to have my alternate speak about it in more detail, but it's our understanding that it's not currently included in the proposed regulatory text.
Okay, thank you for that. And just to circle back on Persis, your comment on low-income individuals taking on for-profit positions. I understand that that's, I guess that's more anecdotal in terms of, you know, there's situations in which that would occur. Do you have like more evidence across the board that we know that this is like a common occurrence? And the reason why I ask is because we, you know, one of the things that we're trying to balance here in terms of, you know, opening it up for profits, we're trying to ensure that borrowers have clarity on whether their employer is eligible. And we're also trying to eliminate administrative hurdles. And so the reason why we're focusing on the employer, and you might recall this discussion from session 1, is because, and when these rules were first negotiated, we had to find a way to operationalize it. And there's no, we haven't found a solution to do that by looking at every job description from a borrower, which is simply not tenable. So that is why we're focusing on the organization, and that will help streamline and ensure that borrowers have a clarity and faster determination. So if we open it up to for-profits, we're having to make an assessment of whether they are providing a public service. So that is an additional hurdle that we have to consider. And also, you know, take into account the lack of transparency that many for-profit companies have, rather than, you know, knowing off the bat it's a 501c3 mission. So just to keep that in mind. Also, one last question another question regarding the contractual representatives for our institutional reps. Do they have any feedback that they can provide in terms of whether, you know, signing an attestation for those contractual employees on a university campus, for example, if that's doable, if there's any barriers to that? I'd love to be interested in hearing.
Thank you, Jen. Bethany.
Does Persis want to respond to that? Because I dropped something on low-wage workers who rely on SNAP and Medicaid in the chat, which disproportionately shows that they are employed by the private sector. And I would imagine other public benefit that we look at would reflect similar numbers. I also think there are particular industries that there are particular contractual employers that focus very much on low-income workers and placement in low-income jobs that we should be taking into account. But Persis.
Thanks. I just real quickly, I think actually the memo that Suzanne cited to earlier does a really great job of describing the growth of outsourcing by governments in healthcare and how that impacts low income and borrowers of color. So I would just point to that resource. Thank you, Bethany.
Thank you for that, Persis. Bethany, did you have additional, or did you?
Yes. And I wanted to echo Persis's comments earlier on the overlap between our concerns about the definitions in public service loan forgiveness and the income contingent and income driven repayment plans, because I think it's a clear sign that those programs are not working as they are currently structured, that everybody wants to be in public service loan forgiveness because it's one, faster, and two, slightly less complicated, or at least the rules are more clear. And so I really think that point needs to be emphasized. Like, I do not think we would see the amount of attention or focus on public service loan forgiveness if we did not have broken other structures and systems here. I wanted to register, I don't know if this is statutory, and if it is, I understand that, but especially given we just exited a global pandemic, it is confusing to me that we would be excluding workers at the WHO and the UN and other folks that have been doing pandemic response work lately. That just strikes me as something that is the little, I'm sure the department has other uses for that money, but this is something that, to me, just given everything that folks have gone through over the past almost 2 years, we would want to be encouraging employment at the WHO. We would want to be encouraging employment in other places that are doing that type of response work. So just registering that I personally, as long as it's not a statutory requirement, would suggest the department not go that far. Yeah, okay, thank you, Heather. Then yes, if it's not a statutory exclusion, I don't understand why we'd want to draw that line, especially given the past 2 years.
Thank you, Bethany, for that. Michaela, you are next.
Yeah, I wanted to just clarify the concern from the department about what you're saying is that you are worried that you'd have to check every individual every time if you opened up a larger definition. And I guess I can just like if that is what I'm understanding, like there are other programs that have systems that allow for both, right? Where you could have your list of like, we know that these companies, you know, are doing this. So those ones would, you know, just kind of automatically qualify. And then if they're not on that, then checking whether or not that employment counted or the work that they were doing. Like you could do both, right? Which would alleviate the administrative burden. I say this because I know like I'm on Medi-Cal and they do that, you know, you have your pre-authorized folks and then you just have to, you know, get approved for that. And also certain social services have some programs for work that you're doing that are already in communication with that program. So I was just wondering if a system similar to what those programs are doing could exist here and help alleviate that administrative burden.
Yeah, we still have to make a determination on whether A, the employer qualifies, whether the employer is a public service, providing a public service, and then B, whether the work itself is public service. And I think we're, for the nonprofits, we're getting to it through the attestation. So, but for, if we were to open it up to for-profits, it would be an additional hurdle. It would create more time on the processing end, no doubt.
But you could do both. Have it an either or.
Do both in terms of, I mean, we're having the conversation, we're open to ideas in terms of, we want to balance streamline. And part of the problem is that, you know, borrowers have been in the queue and they want to know whether they're eligible. So what can we do on the regulatory side to ensure that the borrower knows, hey, that I qualify, I'm certain I qualify for this program, my employer qualifies, and we can process the application, you know, as efficiently and effectively as possible. So that those are the issues that we're trying to balance here.
Okay, thank you, Jennifer. Jay, you are up next.
So nothing to do with my FEL role, but I also do some work with United Way. And I was trying to look at this through the lens of some of the, you know, the housing and houselessness and looking at those types of, that type of work and where does it really fit? Like, so people who are working with the disadvantaged and working on transportation issues and working to make sure, you know, people can raise their economic standing. So I'm not clear, is it both the employer and the employment as drafted now that you're looking at, or is it an or? Not sure if that question is clear, but can you qualify by employer or by employment?
Thank you, Jay. If you want to put that question in the chat, and then so we don't lose track of it, and see if we can, you know, get an answer. All right, Daniel, you are next.
So I want to respond to Jennifer's question about contractors in the institution of higher ed space. So I think it depends on the kind of contracting arrangement, Jennifer. So for example, I'll use two examples. One might be food service, where an institution would contract with an outside provider to provide food services. In that situation, the roster of who the employees are that are coming onto campus on a given day might not be available to the central administrative office. So asking the institution to certify individual employment for full-time employees provided through the food service contractor might be very difficult to manage for an institution, or if so, even if it's a set of employees, it wouldn't necessarily be HR that would be the central focus for that management. So that's one example. I'd use a second example of the space I know very well, which is financial aid services. So there are a number of institutions that contract with outside agencies to provide financial aid services in lieu of hiring an office or having those supports. And they may contract out part or all of those servicers. Those companies tend to be for-profit. A thought would be, again, while I may be able to tell you the roster of who's working at my institution, if I were in one of those institutions, I'm not, but if I were, I might not be able to certify their full-time. So we go back to the question of multiple employers with individual portions of certification that in total could match the 40 hours. I would go back, and I forget if it was Jen or Bethany who said this, or Jerry, but I would go back and just strongly advocate for removing the for-profit distinction and letting students certify, or borrowers state and certify that they are working and provide whatever evidence might be helpful, whether that's a W-2 or whatever. But let the individual borrower be the arbiter of I qualify under this particular type of public service. I can envision having on the form a list of the individual types of public service that we're spelling out and saying, I qualify because I provide services to individuals with disabilities. Whatever it might be, let them check it and then, submit it that way. I think that would, again, get to the question of the role more so necessarily than whether my employer is a for-profit provider or a not-for-profit provider. Oh, and sorry, my very last point is, and I put this in the chat, I would love, not now, given that we're 2 minutes before break, at some point I'd love an update on where we are with processing on the PSLF temporary waiver that was announced last month. I'd love to know what progress the department has made in that effort. Could be an update at some later point in the week, but I'd love an update on that as well.
Thank you, Daniel. All right, one last brief comment. Carol is in for proprietary institutions in place of Jessica. So we'll take Carol's comments, then a couple of announcements, and we will break for lunch. Carol?
Thank you. I'd like to propose opening up eligibility for for-profit service institutions to apply to be considered an eligible institution for the purpose of PSLF, and to qualify the positions that would be eligible, to remove the administrative burden from the department, and to put that on the organizations that would like to be approved for that. Going back to Percy's point earlier, a lot of low-income student borrowers are not taking into consideration the for-profit or nonprofit status of an employer before they accept a position. And a lot of them have no idea which their employer would be. I think that by removing that administrative burden, I still know that there would be some follow-up that would have to be done by the department, but placing that on the institution to justify the eligibility of not only the institution, but also the employment positions that they have in place would be significant. And also, most of these institutions are heavily regulated by state, federal, or industry organizations. So I think that them being in good standing and able to submit documentation to support that, or allow for it to be directly updated on an annual basis or more often as needed, would assist in the continuation of that approval and hopefully make it a little less cumbersome on the department. So.
Thank you, Carol. All right, with that, we are at the 12 o'clock at noon lunch break time. I will, after lunch, you will pick back up on the same issue papers, Form 5. And I need to let you know that Raj has informed us that he will have some limited information to share when you return from lunch. So we'll kick off with Raj and then move back into this topic, okay? Have a great lunch.